Hello there, and welcome to the Drift Science Channel. Tonight, we are going to embark on a quiet journey into the unknown, drifting softly into the spaces where human knowledge ends and the great mysteries of the universe begin. If you enjoy drifting into these scientific wonders with us, please feel free to subscribe. And whenever you feel ready, simply leave a comment letting us know where you are listening from tonight. Our small team reads everyone, and we would truly love to know where you are joining us from. There are, out there in the vastness of the cosmos, and even deep within our own world, mysteries that simply defy explanation. There are places where the laws of physics seem to whisper strange secrets and phenomena that hover just beyond the edge of our understanding, softly pulsing in the dark, waiting to be known. You might imagine a universe entirely mapped and measured, neatly organized into textbooks and equations. But the truth is far more beautiful and far more profound. The more we look, the more we realize how much remains unseen. Slowly drifting through the fabric of space, there are unseen forces pushing entire galaxies apart. Deep beneath the oceans, and quietly humming within the human mind, there are gentle enigmas, waiting patiently in the quiet spaces of the world. It is a comforting thought, perhaps, that we do not know everything, that the universe still holds on to its secrets, inviting us to wonder, inviting us to dream, and reminding us that curiosity is a quiet, endless river, forever flowing into the unknown. Before we begin our journey tonight, take a moment to simply be here. Allow your shoulders to drop, feeling any lingering tension melt away, dissolving into the surface beneath you. Take a slow, deep breath in, filling your lungs with calm, quiet air. And as you exhale, let the events of the day gently fade. There is nowhere else you need to be right now, nothing else you need to do. No problems you need to solve. But for now, all you need to do is relax. Let us drift slowly into our first mystery. Imagine yourself, for a moment, standing outdoors on a perfectly clear, moonless night. Above you, gently unfolding across the velvet darkness, is a sweeping canopy of light. Millions upon millions of stars, softly flickering, like scattered diamond dust against an endless sea of midnight. If you look closely, you might see the faint, glowing band of our own Milky Way galaxy slowly drifting overhead. It is a river of starlight, quiet, peaceful, and unfathomably ancient. For centuries, humanity looked up at this glowing river and believed that what we saw, the light, the stars, the shimmering clouds of gas, was all there was. We believed that the universe was made simply of the things that shine, the things that cast a shadow, the things we could touch or measure or see. But as our eyes grew sharper and our telescopes peered deeper into the velvet dark, we discovered something entirely unexpected. Science found a mystery, a quiet, invisible presence that fundamentally changed how we understand the night sky. It began when astronomers started to watch how galaxies move. You might imagine a galaxy as a magnificent, slow-moving pinwheel of light, billions of stars bound together by the soft, invisible threads of gravity, slowly spinning in the cold, quiet depths of space. Just like a spinning wheel, the stars near the center should move quickly, while the stars near the gentle, fading edges should drift much more slowly. But as scientists watched these distant islands of light, they noticed something strange, almost as if the stars were dancing to a rhythm we could not hear. The stars at the very edges of these galaxies, the ones farthest out in the quiet dark, were moving much too fast. They were spinning with such incredible speed that by all the laws of nature, they should have simply flown away. They should have drifted out into the empty void, untethered and alone. But they did not. They stayed together. The galaxies held their beautiful spiraling shapes. They remained intact, bound in a gentle cosmic embrace. It was as if there was an invisible weight, a massive, unseen anchor holding everything together. This is what we now call dark matter. But do not let the name unsettle you. The word dark simply means it is hidden. It is a quiet mystery. It does not glow like a star. It does not reflect the light of a nearby sun, and it does not block the light from distant galaxies. It is entirely transparent, slipping through the universe like a ghost, like a soft breath of air on a calm night. In some places, out there in the deep cosmos, we have come to realize that this invisible presence is everywhere. In fact, for every star, every planet, every glowing cloud of cosmic dust we can see, there is 5 times as much of this unseen matter gently cradling the universe. It is possible that right now, as you rest here, tiny fragments of this invisible universe are quietly passing through the room around you, slowly drifting through the walls, through the earth beneath you, leaving no trace, making no sound. You cannot feel it, but it is there, a silent companion to everything we know. You might imagine the universe not as an empty void sprinkled with isolated stars, but as a vast, invisible web. Scientists call this the cosmic web. Picture, if you will, a delicate structure made of pure, unseen gravity, a scaffolding woven through the darkness, stretching out across billions of light years. Gently unfolding along the threads of this invisible web are the galaxies we can see. The stars and planets are simply the dewdrops catching the light, resting upon a spider's web in the early morning mist. Without this unseen architecture, the universe as we know it could not exist. The galaxies would simply dissolve, drifting apart like smoke on a gentle breeze. It is the unseen weight of the cosmos that keeps the stars in their slow, graceful dance. It holds the Milky Way together, keeping our own little sun and our own quiet planet safe within the spiral. And yet, despite all our brilliance, despite our towering telescopes and quiet, patient observation, we do not know what this dark matter actually is. It remains a profound, beautiful secret. Perhaps it is made of particles so tiny, so perfectly elusive, that they simply slip through our hands whenever we try to catch them. Perhaps it is a kind of matter that belongs to a different set of rules, a shadow universe quietly coexisting with our own, softly overlapping with the world of light. There is a deep, comforting poetry in this mystery. We look out into the cosmos, seeking answers, and the cosmos simply whispers back that there is more to the story. It reminds us that the universe is far richer, far deeper, and far more complex than we ever dared to dream. As you lie here, breathing slowly, you can picture that vast, invisible web stretching out into the infinite above you. You are part of a universe that is held together by an unseen embrace. You are safe, anchored to a world that is softly held within the slow, turning spirals of a galaxy, protected by the quiet gravity of the dark. Let that thought wash over you like a slow, rhythmic tide. In a world that often demands answers, it is perfectly all right to simply rest in the presence of a beautiful question, to let the mystery be just as it is, unsolved, unknown, and entirely peaceful. Feel your breathing sync with the slow, eternal turning of the stars, in and out, drifting through a universe that is mostly unseen, but deeply connected. Every star, every planet, every grain of dust, and you, all held together in a quiet cosmic harmony. As the concept of this unseen embrace softly fades into the background of your mind, allowing your thoughts to drift deeper into a state of calm, we find ourselves standing on the edge of another great unknown. For if there is an invisible force holding the stars together, there is also a quiet, gentle mystery hidden much closer to home. Slowly drifting down from the vastness of the cosmos, we return to our own quiet earth, preparing to explore the strange, beautiful mysteries of the living world. In the ancient world, there were kings. There were warlords and chieftains and emperors and conquerors of all kinds. But there was nothing quite like the pharaoh. The word pharaoh itself comes from the ancient Egyptian phrase "pera," which meant simply the great house. It referred at first not to a person at all, but to the royal palace, the building, the institution. Only later did it come to mean the ruler himself, and that slow shift of meaning, from building to person, tells you something quietly profound about how the Egyptians thought about their kings. The palace and the ruler were one and the same. The institution was inseparable from the human body that occupied it. But the pharaoh was not merely a king in the way we might understand that word today. A king is a human being with political power. A pharaoh was something altogether different. A pharaoh was a god, not someone who served the gods, not someone who communicated with the gods on behalf of the people, the way a priest might, but an actual living god, walking upon the earth, breathing the same dusty air as the farmers in the fields and the fishermen on the river, and yet entirely unlike them, entirely other. The pharaoh was the earthly embodiment of Horus, the falcon-headed god of the sky, and when a pharaoh died, they became Osiris, god of the dead and ruler of the underworld. Think about what that means for a moment. For the people of ancient Egypt, every single ruler they had ever known was divine. When you looked at the pharaoh, you were looking at a god wearing human skin. When the pharaoh spoke, it was not just a king giving orders. It was the divine order of the universe being expressed through a human voice. This belief shaped absolutely everything about Egyptian society. It shaped how the pharaoh was depicted in art, always larger than the other figures around them, always idealized, always calm and perfect and unchanging, even when the real person was elderly or unwell or frightened. It shaped the ceremonies and rituals that surrounded the pharaoh from birth to death. It shaped the extraordinary lengths to which the Egyptians went to preserve the pharaoh's body after death, because a god's body could not simply be allowed to decay and disappear into the earth. And it shaped the relationship between the pharaoh and the concept of Ma'at that we spoke of in our first chapter. The pharaoh was not just expected to uphold Ma'at. The pharaoh was Ma'at's living expression. As long as the pharaoh ruled wisely and performed the correct rituals and maintained the proper relationships with the gods, the Nile would flood on time, the crops would grow, the sun would rise each morning, and the universe would continue in its ordered and harmonious way. If the pharaoh failed, if Ma'at was disrupted, then chaos could creep in. The floods might fail, disease might spread, enemies might breach the borders. Everything was connected. The health of the kingdom and the health of the cosmos were understood to be the same thing. You might imagine how this would feel, living within such a worldview. Every sunrise is not just a natural event. It is the god Ra, traveling across the sky in his solar bark, bringing light to the world once again. Every flood of the Nile is not just hydrology. It is divine generosity, and every pharaoh sitting upon the throne of Egypt is a thread connecting the human and the divine, keeping the whole enormous tapestry of existence from unraveling. There is something almost unbearably lonely about that image. When you sit with it quietly, the pharaoh, in all their divine glory, was also profoundly alone. No one could touch them without permission. No one could look them directly in the eyes in certain ceremonial contexts. They were surrounded by ritual and protocol at every moment of every day. Their meals were ceremonies. Their baths were ceremonies. Their sleep was hedged about with prayers and protective amulets and the watchful eyes of priests. And yet, and this is one of the things that makes Egypt so deeply human beneath all its grandeur, the historical record gives us glimpses of real people behind the divine masks. There was Ramesses II, who ruled for 67 years and fathered somewhere between 100 and 200 children, and who had a beloved wife named Nefertari, to whom he wrote poetry. There was Thutmose III, who as a child was overshadowed by his formidable stepmother, Hatshepsut, and who grew up to become one of Egypt's greatest military commanders. There was Akhenaten, the strange and visionary pharaoh, who upended the entire Egyptian religious system in favor of worshipping a single solar deity, and whose physical appearance in art was so unusual, elongated, almost dreamlike, that scholars have spent centuries wondering what it meant. And there was, of course, Tutankhamun, the boy king. He came to the throne when he was perhaps 8 or 9 years old. He ruled for only about 10 years before dying, probably in his late teens, possibly from a leg injury, possibly from malaria, possibly from complications that the ancient world simply had no way of treating. He was not, during his lifetime, a particularly important or powerful pharaoh. He was young, and his reign was short, and he was quickly forgotten after his death. And yet, his name is perhaps the most recognized of all the pharaohs now, because his tomb, tucked away in the Valley of the Kings, surrounded by the tombs of far more powerful rulers, was somehow overlooked for more than 3,000 years, until the archaeologist Howard Carter, in 1922, pressed a candle through a small hole in a sealed doorway and looked into the darkness beyond. Carter's colleague, Lord Carnarvon, standing behind him in that narrow corridor, asked, "Can you see anything?" And Carter, his candle flickering in the breath of air from 3 millennia past, said quietly, "Yes, wonderful things, wonderful things." What a soft and extraordinary phrase for that moment. In the glimmer of that candle flame, Carter could see gold, everywhere, the glint of gold. Furniture and statues and jewelry and ritual objects, and the gilded face of a coffin designed to hold a boy who had been a god. That discovery shook the world in 1922, and even now, a full century later, there is something about it that carries that same quiet electricity. The idea that for 3,000 years, that room sat undisturbed, that the candles lit during the funeral of a teenage king eventually guttered out in the sealed darkness, and that darkness held everything perfectly for 30 centuries, until a single new candle flame reached through a hole in the wall and touched it all again. Now, let us drift a little further into the nature of this divine kingship, because there is something else about the pharaoh that most people don't often think about, something that gently complicates the picture. The pharaoh, for most of Egyptian history, was male, but not always. Egypt produced several female pharaohs across its long history, and the most famous and most fascinating was Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut lived and ruled in the 18th dynasty, around 1479 to 1458 BCE. She was the wife of Pharaoh Thutmose II, and when he died, his young son from another wife, the future Thutmose III, was too young to rule alone. Hatshepsut stepped in as regent, but gradually, quietly, she began to do something remarkable. She began to rule not as regent, but as pharaoh. She took on the full titles of kingship. She wore the double crown. She wore the false beard, that ritual symbol of pharaonic authority, strapped carefully to her chin in ceremonies and depicted on her statues. She led trading expeditions to distant lands. She built extraordinary monuments, including one of the most beautiful temple complexes in all of Egypt, at a place called Deir el-Bahari, cut into the cliffs of the western bank at Thebes. And she ruled successfully for about 20 years. After her death, Thutmose III eventually ordered her images chiseled from her monuments. Her name was removed from inscriptions. Her statues were smashed and buried. For a very long time, history forgot about Hatshepsut. Scholars looking at the historical record for her reign found only gaps and mysteries, and the occasional reference to a ruler whose gender didn't quite fit the expected narrative. But the earth remembered her. Her buried statues were discovered in the 20th century. Her name was reconstructed from damaged inscriptions. Her mummy was eventually identified, a quiet, middle-aged woman, well preserved, resting in an unmarked coffin. And now she stands as one of the most remarkable figures in the ancient world. a woman who looked at the title of pharaoh and simply decided it was hers. There is something deeply moving about that when you hold it gently in your mind. In a civilization that defined the pharaoh as the living embodiment of the male god Horus, a woman sat in that chair, wore that beard, and kept Egypt prosperous and peaceful for 2 decades. And the people let her. The priests performed their rituals. The armies followed her orders. The trade routes opened and the temples rose. Because ultimately, what mattered was not the body beneath the crown. What mattered was the function. What mattered was that Ma'at was upheld, that the scales stayed balanced, that the river kept flowing, and the crops kept growing, and the sun kept crossing the sky in its ancient, faithful arc. The pharaoh was a vessel for something larger than any individual person, and sometimes that vessel was a woman with a false beard and the quiet, absolute certainty that the divine order had placed her exactly where she was supposed to be. Let that thought drift through you softly. The idea of certainty, not as arrogance. We will step outside the palace, into the bright Egyptian sun, and begin to look up, because there are structures waiting for us on the horizon. Enormous, impossible, ancient, beautiful structures, pointing toward the sky as if the people who built them were trying to say something to the stars. There is a moment that many people describe when they first see the pyramids of Giza in person, not in a photograph, not on a screen, but in real life, standing on the edge of the desert plateau, with the city of Cairo sprawling behind them, and the sand stretching forward into the distance. The moment is one of disorientation, because the pyramids are so large, so impossibly, quietly large, that the human brain struggles to process them correctly. They don't look real. They look like something painted onto the background of the world, like a stage set, like a dream image. Your eyes keep trying to find the scale, keep searching for something familiar to measure them against, and keep failing, because there is nothing in ordinary human experience that prepares you for them. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built for the pharaoh Khufu around 2560 BCE, stands at approximately 481 feet tall. For nearly 4,000 years, it was the tallest structure ever built by human hands anywhere on Earth. Let that settle for a moment. 4,000 years. The entire span of recorded Western history, from ancient Greece to the present day, fits inside that number with room to spare. And for all of that time, the Great Pyramid was simply the tallest thing humans had ever made. It is built from approximately 2.3 million blocks of stone. Each block weighs, on average, about 2.5 tons. Some of the granite blocks used in the interior chambers weigh as much as 80 tons. 80 tons. Moved without wheels, without cranes, without steel cables or diesel engines, or any of the machinery we would consider absolutely essential for such a task today. And yet there they are. The question of how the pyramids were built has occupied curious minds for thousands of years. The ancient Greeks had theories. Medieval travelers had theories. And ever since archaeology became a formal discipline, scholars have been piecing together the evidence, slowly and carefully, like restoring a mosaic, one tiny tile at a time. What we know now, and this is one of those facts that tends to quietly astonish people, is that the pyramids were not built by slaves. For a very long time, that was the popular assumption. An image taken partly from the biblical story of Exodus, partly from the sheer scale of the undertaking, which seemed to demand forced labor on an almost unimaginable scale. But the archaeological evidence tells a different story, a more human story, a story that, in its own way, is even more remarkable. The workers who built the pyramids were paid, they were fed, they received medical care. We know this because archaeologists have found the remains of the workers' village near Giza, a settlement that housed thousands of people, with bakeries and breweries and facilities for processing enormous quantities of beef and fish. The workers ate well, better, in many cases, than the average Egyptian farmer. They were organized into crews with names. Proud, competitive names like Friends of Khufu and Drunkards of Menkaure. They worked in rotating shifts. They were granted days off. And when they died, and some did die, from accidents, from overexertion, from the ordinary hazards of moving enormous stones in desert heat, they were buried with care near the pyramids they had helped to build, buried with their tools, sometimes with offerings of food and small objects that suggest their families mourned them and honored their memory. These were not slaves driven by fear. These were workers, craftsmen, laborers, specialists, who understood that they were participating in something sacred, something that mattered beyond the span of any individual life. They were building a house for a god. They were constructing the vessel through which a divine king would make his transition from the living world to the eternal one. And perhaps, in some way that is hard to articulate but easy to feel, they found meaning in that. There is something deeply comforting about that image, when you hold it gently. Thousands of ordinary human beings, rising before dawn, eating their bread and drinking their beer, picking up their tools and walking out into the desert to do something enormous, something they would never see completed in a single lifetime. Something built not for them, but for an idea larger than themselves. We do that too, sometimes. We build things we won't see finished. We plant trees whose shade we will never sit in. We work toward futures that belong to people who haven't been born yet. And perhaps that impulse, that reaching beyond the boundaries of our own brief lives, is one of the things that makes us most recognizably human across all the centuries and millennia that separate us from those pyramid builders. Now, the pyramids at Giza are the most famous, but they are not the only pyramids in Egypt. Far from it. There are more than 100 pyramids scattered across the Egyptian landscape, from the stepped pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, the oldest stone structure of such scale ever built, constructed around 2650 BCE, to the smaller, steeper pyramids of the pharaohs of the Middle and New Kingdoms. Some are well preserved, some have eroded to little more than rubble mounds, their limestone casing stones long since stripped away and used to build other things. The stepped pyramid of Djoser is particularly worth pausing on. It was designed by a man named Imhotep, an architect, physician, and high priest who served under Pharaoh Djoser. Imhotep is one of the few non-royal Egyptians to have been deified after death. He was eventually worshipped as a god of medicine and wisdom, and the ancient Greeks identified him with their own healing god, Asclepius. He was a real person, a brilliant, creative mind who looked at the technology of his time and imagined something that had never existed before. Before Imhotep, Egyptian royal tombs were structures called mastabas, low, flat-roofed, rectangular buildings made of mud brick. Imhotep took the concept of the mastaba and stacked them. 6 increasingly smaller mastabas, one on top of another, rising in steps toward the sky. It was a stroke of architectural genius, so complete and so lasting that the pyramid form it inspired would define Egyptian architecture for the next 1,000 years. You might imagine Imhotep standing back from his creation when it was finished, looking up at those 6 rising steps, each one a platform for the next, climbing toward the blue desert sky. Did he understand what he had done? Did he feel, in that moment, the particular human satisfaction of having made something that had never existed before? The quiet, deep pleasure of a problem solved in a way that surprises even the solver? We don't know. History doesn't give us Imhotep's thoughts, but it gives us his building. And the building stands, nearly 5,000 years later, in the desert at Saqqara, still rising toward the same blue sky. Now, there is something else about the pyramids that tends to get lost in the more dramatic stories about their construction and their purpose. Something subtle and beautiful and almost tender. The pyramids were aligned with extraordinary precision to the cardinal directions. The 4 sides of the Great Pyramid of Khufu face north, south, east, and west, with a deviation of less than 1/10 of a degree. 1/10 of a degree. This was achieved without GPS, without satellites, without any of the surveying technology we would consider essential today. It was achieved through careful, patient observation of the stars, specifically the northern circumpolar stars, which never set below the horizon and can be used to find true north with great accuracy. Think about what that means. Before they laid a single stone, before they moved a single block, the builders of the Great Pyramid spent time watching the night sky, carefully, patiently, recording what they saw, finding the fixed point around which the stars appeared to rotate, and then using that fixed point to orient their building with breathtaking precision. The stars were not decoration to the ancient Egyptians. They were not just beautiful lights in the darkness. They were part of the divine order, part of Ma'at. The sky was a map of eternity, and the pharaoh's tomb needed to be properly oriented within that map so that the pharaoh's soul could find its way. Specifically, the pharaoh's soul was believed to travel north after death, joining the circumpolar stars that never set, never disappeared below the horizon, never went dark. The Egyptians called these stars the imperishable ones, because they were always there, always visible, always turning in their slow, stately circle around the northern point of the sky. To be buried in a pyramid aligned with those stars was to be aimed precisely and intentionally toward eternity. There are small shafts in the Great Pyramid, narrow passages cutting through the stone at specific angles. For a long time, archaeologists debated their purpose. Were they ventilation shafts? Passages for the soul to travel through? What has been determined is that these shafts, in the era when the pyramid was built, pointed toward significant stars. The southern shaft of the king's chamber pointed toward Orion's belt, the constellation the Egyptians associated with Osiris, god of the dead. The northern shaft pointed toward the circumpolar star that served as the pole star in that era. The pyramid was not just a tomb, it was a star map, a launch pad, a carefully engineered passage from this world to the next, built from millions of tons of stone and aimed at the sky with the patience and precision of people who understood that getting this right, getting this exactly right, mattered more than anything, because a god deserved nothing less. And now, as we rest in this quiet space together, let's let that image fill the mind gently. The pyramid in the dark, the stars wheeling slowly overhead, the stone cold and still and perfect in its alignment. And somewhere inside, in a chamber lined with granite and silence, the beginning of a journey that the builders believed would last forever. There are few things in human history quite as moving as that. The stubborn, tender, enormous human insistence that some things should last, that some things are worth building to endure, that the love and care and effort poured into something made with human hands can outlast any individual life, any dynasty, any civilization. The pyramids are still there, still standing in the desert, still pointed at the stars, still waiting, quietly, for someone to look up. Close your eyes for a moment, or let them rest softly on the darkness behind your eyelids, and imagine a world in which everything is alive, not just the animals, not just the plants and the river and the people moving through their days, but everything. The sun rising in the morning, alive. The wind moving across the desert, alive. The moment of death, alive. The process of digestion, alive. The act of writing, alive. Every force, every phenomenon, every transition and threshold and natural event, inhabited by a presence, a personality, a divine being who could be named and depicted and spoken to and appealed to and honored. That was the world of ancient Egyptian religion. And it was not a simple world. It was not a world with one god, or even a handful of gods with clearly defined roles. It was a world of extraordinary, layered, sometimes overlapping, sometimes contradictory divine complexity. A world in which the gods themselves changed over time, merged with each other, split apart, took on new aspects, absorbed the qualities of older deities as political and cultural winds shifted across the millennia. Egypt had hundreds of gods. Some scholars suggest the number runs into the thousands if you count all the local deities, the regional variants, the minor divine figures associated with specific towns and trades and moments in time. And all of them were real to the people who worshipped them. All of them mattered. Let us drift gently through just a few of them, because even a brief encounter with the Egyptian pantheon is enough to feel the extraordinary imaginative richness of this civilization, the sheer creative abundance of a people who looked at the world around them and saw faces everywhere. We begin with Ra, or Re, the sun god, the Great One, the central axis around which much of Egyptian religious life turned, particularly in the Old Kingdom period, when the pyramids were being built. Ra was depicted as a man with the head of a falcon, wearing a solar disk on his head, a great golden circle ringed with the Uraeus serpent, the cobra goddess who protected divine authority. Every day, Ra traveled across the sky in his solar bark, a divine boat sailing through the heavens from east to west. And every night, this is the part that catches the breath a little, Ra descended below the horizon and traveled through the underworld, through the Duat, the realm of the dead. For 12 hours of darkness, Ra's bark moved through the 12 caverns of the underworld, passing through dangers and challenges, illuminating the realm of the dead with his light as he went. And in the deepest cavern, in the darkest and most dangerous moment of the night, Ra had to pass through the body of Apophis, the great serpent of chaos, an enormous, writhing serpent that tried every single night to swallow the sun, to end the light, to tip the world permanently into darkness and disorder. And every single night, Ra, with the help of the other gods on his bark, defeated Apep. The serpent was repelled, the bark moved on, and in the morning, Ra rose again from the eastern horizon, reborn, renewed, flooding the world with warmth and light once more. You might feel the beauty of that mythology settling into you gently. The ancient Egyptians looked at the sunrise, something we see every day and often don't notice, and they saw it as a victory, as something that had to be fought for every single night by a god who never tired of the struggle. Every sunrise was not just a natural event, it was a triumph, a renewal, the world choosing, once again, to continue. Then there is Osiris, perhaps the most beloved of all the Egyptian gods. Osiris was the god of the dead, the god of resurrection, the god of agriculture, and the lord of the underworld. He was depicted as a mummified figure, wrapped in white linen, wearing a white crown, holding the crook and flail of divine authority. His skin was often painted green, the color of growing things, or black, the color of the fertile Nile soil. Osiris had a story, one of the most enduring stories in all of human mythology. He was a good and wise king who ruled Egypt and taught humanity the arts of civilization, farming, writing, law, the proper ways of honoring the gods. But his brother Set, the god of chaos and the desert, was jealous of him, and Set killed Osiris, dismembered him, scattered the pieces of his body across the land. But Osiris had a wife, a goddess named Isis, perhaps the most powerful and most widely worshipped goddess in all of Egypt. Isis was the goddess of magic, of healing, of motherhood, of protection. And Isis loved Osiris with a devotion so absolute that it crossed the boundary between life and death. Isis gathered the scattered pieces of Osiris. She reassembled him. She used her extraordinary magical power to breathe life back into him, long enough to conceive a child, their son Horus, the falcon-headed sky god, who would grow up to avenge his father and claim the throne of Egypt. And then Osiris descended into the underworld, where he became its king, the lord of the dead, the judge of souls, the one who weighed the heart against the feather of Ma'at. This story, this beautiful, sorrowful, ultimately hopeful story, was the template through which the ancient Egyptians understood death. Every person who died followed the path of Osiris. Every person was dismembered, in a sense, by death, taken apart from the life they had known, and then, through the proper rituals, through the love and care of those left behind, through the magic of mummification, and prayer and offering, reassembled, made whole again, ready to enter the realm of Osiris and live in eternity. Death was not an ending, it was a transformation. It was the most important journey a person would ever take, and if they had lived rightly, if their heart was light with Ma'at, they would arrive in a place the Egyptians called the Field of Reeds, Aru, a paradise that looked very much like Egypt itself. Green fields beside a river, warm sunlight, the familiar rhythms of planting and harvesting and resting, but perfected, without drought or disease or the grinding difficulty of ordinary life. Simply, the best of Egypt, endlessly. Now let us drift toward another figure in this vast divine landscape. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, writing, magic, and the moon. Thoth was the scribe of the gods, the keeper of records, the one who wrote down the verdict when a soul's heart was weighed in the hall of judgment. He was depicted with the head of an ibis, a long-beaked wading bird that lived along the Nile, or sometimes as a baboon, another animal associated with the dawn and with wisdom. Thoth was believed to have invented writing itself. The sacred script we call hieroglyphics, the Egyptians called Medu Neter, the words of the gods. Writing was not just a practical tool. It was a divine gift, a form of magic, because to write something, to carve it in stone, or press it into clay, or ink it onto papyrus, was to give it a kind of permanence that speech alone could not provide. To write a person's name was to help them live forever. To write a prayer was to send it into the eternal record. This is perhaps why the Egyptians covered absolutely everything with writing and images. Temple walls, tomb walls, coffins, amulets, jewelry, furniture, the bandages wrapped around mummies. Every surface was an opportunity to inscribe something sacred. Every word written was an act of preservation. Every image carved was a form of magic that made what it depicted real and lasting. The scribes who did this work were among the most respected members of Egyptian society. Learning to write hieroglyphics was an extraordinary undertaking. The system used several hundred symbols, each one requiring careful, practiced execution. Children who showed aptitude were sent to scribal schools called houses of life, attached to temples, where they spent years copying texts and learning the vast corpus of religious and administrative literature that held Egyptian society together. A scribe's life was not a glamorous one in the physical sense. They sat for long hours, hunched over their work, squinting in whatever light was available, their fingers permanently stained with ink. But it was a life of status and relative comfort. A popular Egyptian text, called the Satire of the Trades, compared the scribe's profession favorably to every other occupation. The farmer toiled in the mud, the soldier suffered in the heat, the metalworker's eyes burned from the forge. But the scribe sat quietly and did the most important work of all. And then there is Anubis, the jackal-headed god of mummification and the guardian of the dead. He is one of the most visually striking figures in all of Egyptian art. A human body with the sleek black head of a jackal, ears pointed upward, eyes calm and watchful. He stands or kneels beside the scales of judgment, overseeing the weighing of the heart. He was the one who guided souls through the transition from life to death, who protected the bodies of the dead during mummification, who ensured that the journey into the afterlife was navigated safely. Why a jackal? Because jackals were frequently seen around cemeteries. Scavenging, yes, but also somehow always present at those liminal spaces where the living met the dead. The Egyptians took that observation and transformed it into something sacred. The creature that haunted the edges of burial grounds became the divine protector of those very grounds. The ominous became the holy. That is such a distinctly Egyptian move. Taking something that might seem frightening or threatening, the jackal, the serpent, the scorpion, and finding within it a divine quality, a purpose, a place in the cosmic order. even chaos, even death, even the things that frightened people most, had their divine representatives, had their place in Ma'at. Because everything had its place. Everything was part of the pattern. Even the things you couldn't understand. Even the things that hurt. Even the darkness through which the sun traveled every night before rising again. There is a kind of profound comfort in that worldview, if you let yourself feel it. The idea that even the difficult things, even the painful and confusing and frightening things, are part of a larger pattern that holds together. That nothing is truly outside the order of things. That even chaos has its God, and even that God has its role in keeping the balance. The ancient Egyptians looked at their world in all its beauty and difficulty, and they said, "All of this is sacred, all of this matters, all of this is held." Let that settle through you now, gently, like warm light through still water. The idea that everything is held, that you are held, that even in the quiet darkness of this moment, as your breath slows and your body rests and your mind begins to drift towards sleep, you are held in something larger and older and more patient than worry or urgency or the small anxious thoughts of the day. The gods of Egypt are very old now. Their temples are quiet, their priests are long gone, but the questions they were trying to answer, where do we come from? Where do we go? How do we live rightly? How do we face death without despair? Those questions are still here, still alive, still the most important questions anyone has ever asked. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, and the mind begins to loosen its grip on the ordinary, those questions feel very close. There is something about the word mummy that tends to conjure images from horror films. Bandaged figures lurching through darkened corridors, curses and tombs and flickering torchlight. But let us set all of that aside, very gently, and approach the reality of mummification the way the ancient Egyptians themselves approached it, with reverence, with extraordinary care, with the understanding that what they were doing was not macabre or frightening. It was an act of love, an act of devotion, the most important thing you could do for someone you cared about after they had died. To understand why the Egyptians mummified their dead, we need to understand something about how they conceived of the human soul. Because in Egyptian belief, the soul was not a single, simple thing. It was multiple things, multiple aspects of the self, each with its own nature and its own needs. There was the Ka, the life force, the animating energy that made a living person alive. The Ka was sometimes depicted as a person's double, an exact copy of them, made of spirit rather than flesh. When a person died, the Ka was released from the body, but the Ka still needed a home. It still needed somewhere to return to, somewhere to rest, somewhere that it recognized as its own. And that somewhere was the body. There was the Ba, which is sometimes translated as the personality, or the soul in the more familiar sense. The Ba was depicted as a human-headed bird, a beautiful image when you think about it. The essential self, the unique combination of qualities and memories and experiences that made a person who they were, imagined as something with wings, something capable of flight, something that could move between the world of the living and the world of the dead. During the day, the Ba could leave the tomb and travel freely in the world. It could visit places the person had loved in life. It could move through sunlight and open air, but at night, the bar needed to return to the body, needed to reunite with the car in the physical form that had housed them both in life. And if the body was gone, if it had decayed, or been damaged, or simply dissolved back into the earth, there was nowhere to return to. This is why mummification mattered so profoundly. The body was not just a discarded shell once a person died. It was the anchor, the home base, the thing that made continued existence in the afterlife possible. Preserve the body, and you preserved the possibility of eternal life. Let the body decay, and the soul was lost. And so the Egyptians developed, over many centuries and through careful observation and practice, one of the most sophisticated preservation techniques in human history. The process of mummification took 70 days. 70. That number was not arbitrary. It corresponded to the period during which the star Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky and deeply significant to the Egyptians, disappeared below the horizon before rising again. The disappearance and return of Sirius was associated with the death and rebirth of Osiris, and so the preparation of the body for its own death and rebirth took exactly as long as that sacred celestial event. Let us move through the process slowly and gently, the way the priests who performed it would have moved, with deliberate care, with ritual intention at every step. First, the body was taken to a place called the Ibu, the place of purification. It was washed with water from the Nile and with natron, a naturally occurring salt found in dry lake beds in the Egyptian desert. Natron was extraordinary stuff. It had the ability to absorb moisture from organic material, to draw water out of the body's tissues and replace it with something dry and stable. It was the key to preservation. Then the most delicate and most significant step, the removal of the internal organs. The brain was removed first, and this was done through the nose. A long, hooked instrument was inserted into the nostril, up through the nasal passage, and through the thin bone of the ethmoid, into the cranial cavity. The brain was then broken up and drawn out through the nose, piece by careful piece. This sounds extraordinary, almost impossible, and yet the Egyptians did it with enough regularity and consistency that mummified skulls showing clear evidence of this procedure have been found throughout Egypt. The brain, interestingly, was considered unimportant by the Egyptians. It was the organ they discarded. The heart. The heart was everything. The heart was the seat of intelligence, emotion, memory, and moral character. The heart was what was weighed against the feather of Ma'at in the Hall of Judgment, and so the heart was left inside the body, protected, preserved in place. The other organs, the liver, the lungs, the stomach, the intestines, were removed through a careful incision in the left side of the abdomen. They were washed, treated with natron, and placed in 4 special containers called canopic jars. Each canopic jar had a lid shaped like the head of one of the 4 sons of Horus: a baboon for the lungs, a human for the liver, a falcon for the intestines, a jackal for the stomach. Each organ, even in death, had its divine protector. Then the body itself was packed with natron, both inside and out, and left to dry for 40 days. 40 days of stillness, of slow, patient transformation, the moisture drawing out of the tissues, the body gradually becoming something that would not decay, something that would endure. After 40 days, the natron was removed, the body was washed again, and now came the final, most visible stage, the wrapping. The mummy was wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen bandages, fine white linen, torn into strips and wound carefully around the body, starting with the fingers and toes, each one wrapped individually, then the limbs, then the torso, then the whole form wound and rewound in layer after layer of white cloth. Between the layers, amulets, small protective objects, charms and symbols made of faience or gold or semi-precious stone, tucked between the bandages at specific locations on the body to protect the deceased on their journey. A scarab beetle amulet was placed over the heart. The scarab was one of the most important symbols in all of Egyptian religion. The dung beetle, which rolls a ball of dung across the ground, an image the Egyptians connected to the sun god, rolling the solar disk across the sky. A humble insect, transformed into a symbol of the creative force of the universe. The heart scarab was often inscribed with a spell from the Book of the Dead, an instruction to the heart not to testify against its owner in the Hall of Judgment. There is something both solemn and tender in that image. A small carved beetle placed over a preserved heart, carrying a whispered instruction: be kind. Remember only the good. Do not give us away. Across the face of the wrapped mummy, a mask was placed. For royalty, this mask was gold. Like the extraordinary golden mask of Tutankhamun, which you may have seen in photographs, that serene and perfect face, gazing out from the darkness of 3 millennia. For ordinary people, the mask was painted plaster or cartonnage, still beautifully made, still careful and individual, still an attempt to give the preserved body a face that could be recognized by the returning Ba, because the Ba needed to recognize its home. The face on the mask was the door the soul would knock on at night, returning from its daytime wanderings, asking to come in. The completed mummy was then placed in a coffin, or, for the wealthy, a series of nested coffins, each one fitting inside the next, like a set of carved wooden dolls. The innermost coffin held the body, the next coffin held the innermost coffin, and so on, layer after layer of protection, each decorated with prayers and images and the divine figures who would guard the deceased on their journey. The whole assembly might then be placed inside a large stone sarcophagus, from a Greek word meaning flesh-eater, which is grimly accurate, though the Egyptians themselves would not have used such a term. They would have called it a house for eternity, a permanent home for a permanent resident. And then the tomb was sealed. Now, there is one more aspect of mummification that tends to quietly astonish people when they first learn it. The Egyptians did not only mummify humans, they mummified animals too, millions of them. Cats, obviously, the sacred animals of the goddess Bastet, beloved household companions, and also powerful symbols of protection. Dogs, ibises for Thoth, falcons for Horus, crocodiles for Sobek, bulls for Apis, baboons, fish, even beetles, even shrews. The animal mummies were sometimes offerings, things left at temples as gifts to the gods, the ancient equivalent of lighting a candle in a church. Sometimes they were beloved pets, mummified so they could accompany their owners into eternity. Sometimes they were sacred animals that had lived out their days in temple precincts, tended by priests, fed and groomed and honored as divine representatives on earth. When the cat catacombs at Saqqara were excavated, a series of underground galleries that contained hundreds of thousands of mummified cats, the scale of it was almost incomprehensible. Hundreds of thousands, all carefully wrapped, all placed there by people who believed that this act of preservation and offering mattered, who believed that these small soft creatures deserved the same careful attention to eternity that they themselves hoped for. There is something very moving about that, when you allow yourself to feel it fully. A civilization that looked at a cat, a small, purring, ordinary household cat, and decided it was sacred, decided it deserved to live forever, decided that the care and love and attention given to any living creature was worth extending beyond death. The Egyptians were, in many ways, the most death-aware civilization in human history. They thought about death constantly. They prepared for it their entire lives. They spent enormous resources on tombs and coffins and mummification and all the rituals surrounding the transition from this world to the next. But here is the thing that is easy to misunderstand about that. They were not morbid. They were not fearful. Their preoccupation with death was not the preoccupation of people who despaired of it. It was the preoccupation of people who believed, with quiet and complete conviction, that death was not the end, that the care taken now would be rewarded later, that the 70 days of preparation and all the expense and labor and love that went into them were an investment in something that would pay dividends in eternity. They were preparing for the best journey they could imagine, and they wanted to arrive well equipped. Let that thought rest with you now, softly, in the quiet of this moment. The idea of preparation, the idea that care taken now matters later, that the attention we give to things, the love we pour into them, does not disappear. It accumulates. It persists. It becomes part of something that outlasts the moment in which it was given. The mummies of ancient Egypt still rest in museums and tombs around the world, still wrapped in their ancient linen, still wearing their painted faces, still carrying their heart scarabs and their amulets and their silent instructions. Still here, thousands of years later, because someone once loved them enough to try to make them last forever. And in a way, they did. Imagine standing in front of a wall, a great, smooth, sun-warmed wall of pale limestone, covered from floor to ceiling in small, careful carvings. Birds with folded wings, a seated figure with hands resting on knees, a snake coiled in a perfect spiral, an eye open and watchful, a pair of legs walking, a loaf of bread, an owl with round, solemn eyes, a hand, a mouth, a lion lying quietly with its paws stretched forward. Hundreds of these images, arranged in careful columns and rows, each one precise, each one deliberate, each one carrying meaning, not just decorative meaning, not just artistic meaning, but linguistic meaning, each one a sound, or a word, or an idea, pressed into stone by a careful hand holding a copper chisel, thousands of years ago, in a world that no longer exists. This is hieroglyphics, the Medu Neter, the words of the gods. And for nearly 1500 years, from roughly 400 CE, when the last known hieroglyphic inscription was carved, until 1822 CE, when a French scholar named Jean-François Champollion finally cracked the code, no living person on earth could read them. Think about that for a moment. A language that had been spoken and written and read by millions of people across 3,000 years of continuous civilization simply fell silent. The knowledge of how to read it was lost. Not gradually, not partially, but completely. The last priests who could read hieroglyphics died and took that knowledge with them into the same eternity they had spent their lives preparing for. And the walls of Egypt, covered in text, became mysterious, became beautiful and baffling, and entirely opaque. For those 15 centuries, travelers and scholars looked at hieroglyphic inscriptions and understood nothing. They guessed, they theorized. Some believed the symbols were purely symbolic, that each image represented a concept rather than a sound. Some believed they were magical formulas, too sacred and powerful to be decoded by ordinary human intellect. Some believed they were a kind of divine pictorial language that communicated directly with something beyond rational understanding. None of them were right, and the answer, when it finally came, was both simpler and more complex than any of them had imagined. The key was the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone is a large fragment of a granodiorite stele, a carved stone slab, discovered in 1799 by French soldiers digging fortifications near the town of Rashid, or Rosetta, in the Nile Delta. The stone was inscribed with a decree issued in 196 BCE, during the reign of the Ptolemaic pharaoh Ptolemy V. And crucially, the decree was written in 3 scripts: hieroglyphics at the top, Demotic, a later cursive Egyptian script, in the middle, and ancient Greek at the bottom. Here was the key. Here was the bridge. Because ancient Greek, unlike hieroglyphics and Demotic, was a language that European scholars already knew how to read. If the 3 scripts said the same thing, and they did, then matching the Greek text to the hieroglyphic text should, in theory, reveal how the ancient script worked. In theory. In practice, it took more than 20 years of concentrated effort by some of the finest linguistic minds in Europe before Champollion finally made the breakthrough. What he discovered, what unlocked everything, was that hieroglyphics were not purely symbolic. They were not a simple picture language where a bird meant a bird and an eye meant an eye. They were a complex, multi-layered writing system that used 3 different types of signs simultaneously. Some signs were logograms. They represented the word for the thing they depicted. A picture of a sun could mean the word for sun. A picture of a house could mean the word for house. Some signs were phonograms. They represented sounds rather than meanings. A picture of a mouth represented the sound R. A picture of an owl represented the sound M. A picture of a hand represented the sound D. These phonetic signs could be combined to spell out words letter by letter, the way an alphabet works. And some signs were determinatives, symbols placed at the end of a word to indicate its general category without contributing any sound. A small seated man might be placed at the end of any word referring to a male person. A small seated woman at the end of words referring to females. A pair of walking legs at the end of words involving motion. A roll of papyrus tied with string, indicating that the word was abstract, something that existed in thought rather than in physical form. All 3 types of sign, logograms, phonograms, and determinatives used simultaneously, woven together in a single inscription. When you understand that, when you really feel the complexity of what Egyptian scribes were doing every time they picked up their tools, you begin to appreciate just how extraordinary this writing system was, and just how extraordinary the people who mastered it must have been. Egyptian children who were chosen for scribal training began learning hieroglyphics very young. They started by copying simple signs over and over until the shapes were as natural to their hands as breathing. They progressed to copying entire texts, religious passages, administrative documents, mathematical problems, medical prescriptions. They learned not just the classical hieroglyphic script used for monument inscriptions, but also hieratic, a faster, more cursive version of the same script used for everyday writing on papyrus, and later, demotic, a simplified script for administrative and commercial use. The hieroglyphic script itself had several hundred commonly used signs, and the full repertoire ran to several thousand. Learning them all was the work of years, and maintaining the skill, keeping the hand steady and the eye true, and the mind holding all those hundreds of forms and their sounds and meanings simultaneously, was the work of a lifetime. There is something almost meditative about the image of an Egyptian scribe at work, sitting cross-legged, a wooden pallet holding cakes of black and red ink balanced on one knee, a papyrus scroll, or a flat piece of limestone, called an ostrakon, used for practice and informal writing, resting on the other. A thin rush brush, held between the fingers, dipped into the ink, drawn across the surface in careful, confident strokes. Each sign required a specific sequence of strokes, like a carefully choreographed small dance of the hand. The ibis, with its long curved beak and folded wings. The seated man, with his legs tucked neatly beneath him. The cobra rearing up, with its hood spread. The Eye of Horus, one of the most beautiful and recognizable symbols in all of Egyptian art. A stylized human eye, with the distinctive markings of a falcon beneath it, representing healing and protection and the power of divine sight. The Eye of Horus, called the Wedjat Eye, or the Eye of Ra in some contexts, deserves a moment of its own, because it is not just beautiful, it is mathematically interesting, in a way that feels almost impossible for an ancient symbol. The markings that make up the Wedjat Eye correspond, in Egyptian mathematical notation, to fractions, specific fractions: 1/2, 1/4, 1/8, 1/16, 1/32, 1/64. Added together, these fractions come very close to one whole. Not quite. They sum to 63/64. And some scholars have suggested that the missing 64th part was left intentionally, representing the portion of the eye that Thoth restored through magic after Horus lost it in battle with Set. The portion that only the divine could complete. Whether or not that interpretation is correct, the idea is extraordinary. A symbol that contains mathematics within its proportions. A piece of art that is simultaneously a medical symbol, a protective amulet, a fraction system, and a mythological reference. Layered as everything in Egypt was layered, with multiple meanings existing simultaneously, each one valid, each one present. This layering of meaning was fundamental to how the Egyptians thought and communicated. A single hieroglyphic inscription could be read in multiple directions, left to right, right to left, or top to bottom, depending on the orientation of the figures within it. You knew which direction to read by looking at the way the human and animal figures faced. They always faced toward the beginning of the text. If the owl faced right, you read from right to left. If it faced left, you read from left to right. There was also the matter of what was deliberately left out. The Egyptians were careful, sometimes, about what they wrote in full. The word for crocodile, for instance, was sometimes written without its determinative, the small crocodile image that would normally accompany it, inside tombs, because writing the full word, complete with the image of the creature, was believed to potentially bring the actual animal into the sacred space of the tomb. The magic of writing was real enough that its products needed to be handled with care. By the same token, certain powerful or protective spells were written in full and with great care, precisely because the act of writing them made them effective. The words of the Book of the Dead, inscribed on tomb walls or on papyrus scrolls placed with the mummy, were not just reminders or descriptions of what would happen in the afterlife. They were instructions. They were activations. They were magic worked in ink and careful strokes of a brush. To write was to make real. To name was to call into being. Language was not just communication, it was creation. There is something in that idea that feels not so different from our own experience of language, when you think about it quietly. The way a word, carefully chosen, can change the weight of a feeling. The way writing something down makes it more real than just thinking it. The way speaking certain things aloud, vows, declarations, the naming of something you've been afraid to name, shifts something in the world. The Egyptians simply took that intuition seriously enough to build it into the foundations of their entire civilization. And the legacy of that seriousness is visible everywhere. On the walls of temples still standing in the desert at Luxor and Karnak and Abu Simbel and Edfu. On the painted interiors of tombs in the Valley of the Kings. On the sides of obelisks that now stand in Paris and London and Rome and New York, carried away by conquerors and collectors and the restless human desire to possess beautiful things. All of those inscriptions, all of those carefully carved birds and eyes and hands and serpents are still speaking, still saying the things they were carved to say thousands of years ago by scribes who believed that words written in stone would last forever. And they were right. The stone is still there. The words are still there. And now, thanks to Champollion and the decades of work that followed his breakthrough, we can hear them again. After 1,500 years of silence, the words of the gods are speaking once more. Let that thought rest with you, very gently now. The idea that nothing truly spoken with care is ever entirely lost. That something preserved with love, in stone, in memory, in the careful transmission of knowledge from one mind to another, can survive far longer than anyone might think. Words are patient, they wait, and eventually, someone comes along who can hear them. We have spent time, so far, among gods and pharaohs, pyramids and priests, the sacred language of the divine, and the elaborate rituals of death and resurrection. And all of that is true and real and deeply woven into the fabric of ancient Egyptian civilization. But tonight, let us step away from the temples for a little while. Let us walk away from the great stone monuments and the gilded burial chambers and the solemn processions of priests carrying sacred objects through incense smoke. Let us walk instead into an ordinary street, in an ordinary town, on an ordinary morning, perhaps 3,000 years ago. Let us see what life looked and felt and smelled like for the vast majority of people who lived in ancient Egypt. Not pharaohs, not high priests, not famous generals or celebrated scribes. Just people, waking up, eating breakfast, going to work, coming home. Because one of the most quietly astonishing things about ancient Egypt, when you spend time with the archaeological evidence, is how familiar it feels. The morning would begin before sunrise. The heat of an Egyptian day built quickly once the sun crested the horizon, and the sensible approach to almost any outdoor task was to accomplish as much of it as possible in the cool of the early morning. Farmers were in their fields at first light. Bakers had their ovens going well before dawn. The markets along the river were already busy by the time the sun began to paint the sky in shades of apricot and gold. An ordinary Egyptian home was modest, a rectangular structure of mud brick, sun-dried, not fired, with thick walls that kept the interior cool during the heat of the day. The floors were beaten earth or simple plaster. The roof was flat and accessible by an external staircase. And the roof was important. It was where families slept during the hottest months, lying under the open sky, catching whatever breeze drifted across from the river or the desert. Furniture was simple, low beds of wooden frames strung with woven cords or leather strips. Small wooden headrests, hard, curved supports that lifted the head off the sleeping surface, serving the function of a pillow while keeping hairstyles intact and allowing air to circulate around the neck in the heat. Clay pots for water and grain, wooden chests for storing clothing and tools, and the small personal objects that accumulated in any household across any era. Lighting was provided by small clay lamps filled with castor oil or animal fat, a floating wick of twisted linen drawing the oil upward and producing a small, warm, wavering flame. Not bright, not steady, just enough to see by, to move through the rooms of a house after dark, to read if you were literate, to do a final piece of mending before sleep. The kitchen, if you could call it that, was typically an open area in the courtyard or on the roof. A clay oven, clay pots, a hand mill for grinding grain into flour. The smell of bread baking was, in many ways, the defining smell of ancient Egyptian life. Bread was the foundation of the diet, supplemented by beer, which was less an indulgence and more a nutritional staple. Thick and cloudy, and not particularly alcoholic by modern standards, providing calories and hydration in a form that was safer than raw river water. Vegetables were plentiful: onions, garlic, leeks, lettuce, cucumbers, radishes, lentils and chickpeas, figs and dates, and the occasional pomegranate. Fish from the Nile, dried in the sun or salted for preservation, was accessible to people at almost every economic level. Meat, particularly beef, was more of a luxury, reserved for feast days and special occasions, though waterfowl and game birds were hunted and eaten with some regularity. The Egyptians were, by the standards of the ancient world, relatively well fed. The fertility of the Nile Valley meant that in good years, and there were many good years, food was abundant enough to support not just the farmers who grew it, but an entire pyramid of specialists above them: scribes and soldiers, priests and craftsmen, architects and physicians, all fed by the surplus produced by those quiet, patient farmers working their narrow strip of black soil between the river and the desert. Clothing was simple and practical, and adapted to the climate. Linen was the fabric of Egypt, cool, light, washable, made from the flax plant that grew abundantly in the Nile Valley. Men typically wore a simple linen kilt, white or off-white. Women wore a close-fitting linen dress, often with straps at the shoulders. Children, particularly young children, often wore nothing at all during the hottest months. This was not a mark of poverty, it was sensible. The wealthy wore finer linen, bleached to brilliant white, pleated with extraordinary precision. They wore jewelry, broad collars of faience beads in turquoise and blue and gold, bracelets and anklets, earrings and finger rings. They wore kohl around their eyes, that distinctive dark liner that you see in almost every Egyptian portrait, which was not purely cosmetic. Kohl, made from ground galena or malachite, had practical properties. It reduced glare from the sun. It had mild antiseptic qualities that helped protect the eyes from infection. And it was sacred, associated with the Eye of Horus and its protective power. To wear kohl was to put on armor in a subtle and beautiful way. Hair was another form of expression. Natural hair was often kept short for practical reasons in the heat, but wigs were common and widely used by both men and women of sufficient means. Elaborate wigs of real human hair or vegetable fiber, shaped and oiled and braided and adorned with beads and gold. Changing a wig was, in a sense, like changing your whole appearance, a versatility that our own era, with its hair extensions and styling products, would recognize entirely. Children played. This is one of those facts that sounds obvious but carries a particular warmth when you encounter it in the archaeological record. Egyptian children had toys, wooden and clay animals with moving parts, balls made of leather or clay, spinning tops, dolls with articulated limbs and painted faces, and real hair woven from vegetable fiber. There are small wooden figures of animals, crocodiles with movable jaws, horses on wheels, cats with bronze eyes, that were made for children to play with, objects of pure delight, objects made by adult hands for the pleasure of small ones. Children swam in the Nile. They played games that looked very much like games children play today. They had pets, cats, obviously, but also dogs, and occasionally more exotic animals. There are wall paintings that show children being taught to swim, children playing with balls, children riding on the backs of adults. The tenderness in those images crosses 3,000 years without losing anything. Family life was warm and close and valued. The nuclear family, parents and children, was the basic unit of Egyptian society, and marriage was taken seriously even in the absence of elaborate legal ceremony. A man and woman who set up a household together were, for practical purposes, married. Divorce was possible, and not particularly stigmatized, though property rights in such situations were carefully delineated. Women in ancient Egypt had legal rights that would not be matched in much of the Western world for another 3,000 years. They could own property, inherit, make contracts, bring lawsuits, and conduct business independently. They could and did work as weavers, musicians, professional mourners, temple administrators, and occasionally physicians. There is a letter preserved on papyrus written by an Egyptian man to his dead wife. He wrote to her after her death because he believed, sincerely, that she could hear him, that she was present in the world of the dead and could still be spoken to. And what he wrote was not a prayer exactly, not a formal invocation. It was a letter, a real letter, full of the ordinary pain of loss and the confused grievance of someone who felt that things had gone wrong since she died, that his household was in disorder, that his children were struggling, that he needed her help. He addressed her directly, intimately, the way you would address someone you expected to write back. He was not performing a ritual, he was talking to his wife. There is another fragment of an ancient Egyptian love poem, part of a collection now called the Love Songs of the New Kingdom, in which a young man describes his beloved. He talks about her eyes, her laugh, the way she moves. He talks about his heart speeding up when he sees her from a distance. He talks about the specific, incandescent quality of being in love that makes an ordinary afternoon feel extraordinary. He was a young man in love 3,000 years ago, living in a mud brick house along the Nile, wearing a linen kilt and kohl around his eyes, eating bread and onions and drinking cloudy beer. And he felt exactly what you have felt, exactly what every human being who has ever loved another person has felt. That particular quickening, that particular warmth, the ordinary and the beautiful, wound together so tightly that you cannot always tell them apart. Festivals were important events in the Egyptian calendar, not just religious formalities but genuine celebrations, occasions for music and dancing, and the communal consumption of special foods, and the relaxation of ordinary social hierarchies. During certain festivals, the statues of the gods were carried out from the inner sanctuaries of their temples, where they normally lived in private, tended only by priests, and processed through the streets so that ordinary people could see them and receive their blessings directly. These processions were occasions of great joy. People lined the streets, musicians played, acrobats performed, beer and bread were distributed freely. The boundary between the divine and the ordinary dissolved, briefly, in the noise and color and warmth of shared celebration. Music was everywhere in Egyptian life. Harps, lutes, flutes, clappers, sistrums, a kind of rattle sacred to the goddess Hathor, drums and cymbals and the human voice, raised in praise or in pleasure, or in the simple, ancient impulse to make sound, because sound is beautiful. Blind musicians were particularly revered, their other senses believed to be heightened by the absence of sight, their music understood to reach places that sighted performers could not. Dancers performed at festivals and banquets and temple ceremonies. Their art was highly developed and highly valued. Wall paintings show figures bent into positions of extraordinary grace and flexibility, bodies arched, limbs extended in attitudes that suggest both rigorous training and natural joy. Physicians practiced medicine with a combination of practical knowledge and magical intervention that reflected the Egyptian understanding that the physical and the spiritual were inseparable. Medical papyri that have survived detailed treatments for everything from broken bones to eye diseases to digestive ailments, with instructions that are sometimes strikingly rational. Clean the wound, apply this herb, change the dressing daily, and sometimes magical. Recite this spell, while touching the affected area with your hand. Both approaches were considered equally valid. Both were expected to contribute to healing. The Egyptians identified the heart as the center of intelligence and emotion. We've touched on this already, but they also had a fairly sophisticated understanding of the circulatory system. They knew that the heart was connected to vessels that ran throughout the body, and that these vessels carried something essential to life, though they interpreted that something differently than we would. They recognized the pulse. They understood that fever indicated illness. They knew that certain plants had medicinal properties and catalogued those properties carefully. A physician in ancient Egypt was a respected professional. The title Sonnu, the physician, was an honored one. And certain physicians became famous enough to be remembered long after their deaths. Imhotep, whom we met in our chapter on the pyramids, was revered as a healer for thousands of years after his death. He was the patron of physicians, the first named architect in history who was also the first named physician. One person, two extraordinary gifts, quietly shaping the world from behind the scenes of a divine king's story. Let that rest with you gently now. The image of ordinary life, full, warm, complicated, joyful, painful, musical, delicious, loving, grieving, playing, healing ordinary life, continuing beneath and between and around the great monuments and the divine dramas. The pyramids are magnificent. The temples are breathtaking. The gods are vast and strange and wonderful. But the pyramids were built by people who went home in the evening and ate dinner with their families. The temples were tended by priests who had children who played with wooden crocodiles. The gods were worshipped by men and women who fell in love and wrote letters to their dead wives and felt their hearts quicken at the sight of someone beautiful. Egypt was not just grand, it was human, deeply, warmly, recognizably human. And that humanity, quiet and persistent across 3,000 years of extraordinary history, is perhaps the most wonderful thing of all. On the western bank of the Nile, directly across the river from the ancient city of Thebes, which we now call Luxor, there is a place that feels unlike anywhere else on earth. You approach it through desert, through pale, dry, sun-bleached limestone hills that rise and fold around you as the road winds deeper into the plateau. The landscape becomes increasingly austere as you travel further from the river. The green of the Nile Valley falls away behind you. The air grows hotter and drier. The silence becomes something almost physical, a presence rather than an absence, pressing gently against your ears. And then the hills open, and you are in the Valley of the Kings. It doesn't look, at first, like much. A dry, bowl-shaped depression in the limestone plateau, surrounded by pale cliffs that glow amber and cream in the afternoon light. The ground is rocky and uneven. There is no shade, no water, no sound, except the occasional whisper of a desert wind moving through the rocks. But beneath your feet, the valley is full. Over a period of roughly 500 years, from approximately 1550 BCE to 1070 BCE, the pharaohs of Egypt's New Kingdom period abandoned the pyramid as their preferred form of royal tomb and chose instead to be buried here, in this quiet, secret valley, hidden from the world, cut deep into the living rock of the plateau, down through layers of limestone and flint. into chambers decorated with the most extraordinary art in the ancient world. There are at least 63 known tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Some are simple, modest affairs, a single corridor leading to a single chamber. Others are vast, labyrinthine complexes of corridors and staircases and antechambers and side rooms and burial halls, descending sometimes more than 100 meters into the earth, their walls covered from floor to ceiling in painted plaster, every inch of surface occupied by images and hieroglyphic text that documented the journey of the royal soul through the underworld. The decision to move away from pyramids was, in some ways, a practical one. Pyramids were extremely visible. They announced themselves to the world, saying clearly and loudly, "Here lies a pharaoh, and everything that was buried with them." They were, despite all the precautions taken during their construction, targets for tomb robbers from very early on. The wealth placed inside a royal pyramid, the gold and jewelry and furniture and ritual objects deemed necessary for a comfortable eternal life, was irresistible, and the pyramids, for all their massiveness, could not ultimately protect their contents. The valley offered something different: concealment. The tombs were cut into the rock with no external monument above them. The entrances were small and easily hidden. The valley itself was remote enough to be guarded, and it was guarded by a village of workers who lived nearby and whose entire purpose was the construction and protection of the royal tombs. A village called Deir el-Medina, which we will return to in a moment, because it is one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites in all of Egypt. But the concealment did not ultimately work. Almost every tomb in the Valley of the Kings was robbed in antiquity, most of them within a few hundred years of being sealed. The robbers were often people who knew the valley well. Sometimes they were the very workers who had built the tombs, the ancient Egyptian equivalent of inside jobs. The priests and officials who discovered the robberies responded by quietly gathering what remained of the royal mummies and moving them to hidden caches, collective hiding places, where dozens of royal mummies were tucked together for safety, rewrapped, relabeled, and sealed away. One such cache, discovered in 1881 at a site called Deir el-Bahari, contained the mummies of more than 40 individuals, including some of the most powerful pharaohs in Egyptian history: Thutmose III, Ramesses II, Seti I. They had been gathered together by ancient priests, trying to protect them, and they had lain undisturbed for nearly 3,000 years, stacked in a narrow rock-cut corridor, until an Egyptian man named Ahmed Abd el-Rasul, whose family had known about the cache for years and had been quietly selling objects from it, finally revealed its location to authorities. When the mummies were transported by boat down the Nile to Cairo, the people along the riverbanks came out to watch them pass. Women wailed and threw dust on their heads in the traditional gesture of mourning. Men fired guns in salute. The whole of Egypt, it seemed, felt something profound about the passage of those ancient bodies down the river, something that crossed all the centuries between then and now, and touched something very old and very deep in the human heart. Now, let us descend, very gently, into one of these tombs. Let us imagine walking down a corridor cut into pale limestone, the walls smooth and cool beneath your hand, the air smelling of dust and time. The light grows dimmer as you descend, the sounds of the valley above you fade, and the walls begin to speak. The imagery in New Kingdom royal tombs was drawn primarily from sacred texts known collectively as the Books of the Underworld, the Amduat, the Book of Gates, the Book of Caverns, the Litany of Ra. These were not ordinary religious texts. They were maps, detailed, vivid, sometimes bewildering maps of the journey the royal soul would take through the 12 hours of the night, through the 12 regions of the Duat, the underworld, before emerging with the sun at dawn, reborn. Each hour of the night was depicted as a distinct region, populated by its own gods and creatures and challenges. Some regions were peaceful, fields of light, rivers of fire, halls where blessed souls rested. Others were more difficult, narrow corridors guarded by serpents, lakes of fire, regions of darkness so complete that the text described it as the place where nothing can be seen. The imagery is sometimes strange and hallucinatory when viewed through modern eyes. Figures with multiple heads, gods whose bodies are made of serpents, the sun god traveling through the underworld in a form that combined the disk of the sun with the ram-headed god of the setting sun, creating a composite deity, Ra Osiris, who embodied the fusion of the living and the dead, the solar and the chthonic, the above and the below. But within its own logic, within the internal world of Egyptian belief, it all makes profound sense. The underworld was not a place of punishment, it was a place of transformation, of passage. The challenges encountered there were not arbitrary obstacles. They were the natural difficulties of any great journey. And the soul, armed with the correct knowledge, the correct spells, the correct magical formulas painted on the walls around it, could navigate them successfully. The tomb itself was the equipment for that navigation. The walls were not decorations, they were tools. Everything painted on those walls, every spell, every image, every carefully depicted gate and guardian and magical formula was there to help the royal soul find its way, to give it the words it needed to speak at each threshold, to provide the knowledge it needed to answer each challenge correctly. Standing in the tomb of Seti I, which is widely considered one of the most beautiful in the entire valley, the effect is overwhelming even for a modern visitor who doesn't believe in any of it. The paintings are luminous, white and gold and blue and red and green, applied with extraordinary skill to a surface of the finest plaster, so smooth it looks like ceramic. The figures are elegant and precise. The hieroglyphs are perfectly formed. The whole vast complex of corridors and chambers, extending more than 100 meters into the rock, with a burial hall whose ceiling is painted with astronomical charts showing the constellations as the Egyptians saw them, feels less like a building and more like a universe. A complete universe, built inside a mountain, for a single person to inhabit forever. Now, let us visit Deir el-Medina, the village of the tomb workers, because this community, preserved in extraordinary detail by the dry desert air, gives us one of the most intimate windows into ordinary ancient Egyptian life that exists anywhere. Deir el-Medina was home to the craftsmen and artisans who built and decorated the royal tombs. Painters, sculptors, draftsmen, stonemasons, carpenters, scribes. These were highly skilled workers, among the most accomplished artists in Egypt, and they lived in a purpose-built village just over the hill from the Valley of the Kings. What makes Deir el-Medina so extraordinary is the volume of written records it has preserved. Because these workers were literate, or many of them were, they wrote things down. They wrote on ostraca, those flat limestone flakes, and pottery shards that served as the everyday writing material of working people. And those ostraca, thousands of them, have survived in the dry desert air and been excavated by archaeologists, giving us an almost unparalleled view of what ordinary Egyptian life was really like. What did they write? Everything. Work rosters, accounts of who was present and who was absent on any given day, requests for tools and materials, love poems, legal complaints, lists of goods, letters to family members, notes about dreams, records of disputes between neighbors, accounts of transactions, 3 bundles of vegetables for a length of linen, 2 fish for a pot of fat, and absence records. The workers of Deir el-Medina kept records of why people didn't show up for work, and these records, read by scholars today, have a quality of warmth and recognizable humanity that is almost startling. People were absent because they were ill, because a family member was ill, because they were brewing beer for a festival, because they were dealing with the aftermath of a scorpion sting, because they were, in the delicate phrasing of the original, having a bad day. Having a bad day. 3,000 years ago, in a limestone village above the Valley of the Kings, a worker picked up a flake of stone and recorded for posterity that his colleague wasn't in today because he was having a bad day. The workers of Deir el-Medina also, when they weren't building tombs for pharaohs, built tombs for themselves. And those tombs, far smaller than the royal ones, but built and decorated with the same skills their owners applied every day to royal commissions, are beautiful, intimate, full of scenes from everyday life that complement and contrast with the grand mythological narratives of the royal tombs, scenes of family life, of feasting and music and the small pleasures of ordinary existence, scenes of the judgment of the soul, the same weighing of the heart against the feather of Ma'at that adorned royal tombs, but depicted in a more personal, less formal way. The figures in these smaller tombs have character, individuality. The artists, given freedom to depict themselves and their families, allowed something warmer and more specific to emerge than was possible in the official grandeur of royal commissions. One of the most celebrated non-royal tombs in the valley is that of a man named Sennacherib, a craftsman who worked during the reign of Ramesses II. His tomb is small, barely more than a vaulted chamber, but its paintings are among the finest examples of Egyptian art that survive anywhere. The colors are vivid and fresh after more than 3,000 years. The figures are graceful and alive, and the scene on the end wall, Sennacherib and his wife Nefertiti working in the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise, has a quality of quiet domestic happiness that is utterly affecting. They are harvesting wheat together, in paradise. An elderly craftsman and his wife, spending eternity doing something that looks very much like the ordinary work of their ordinary lives, but bathed in golden light, surrounded by date palms and lotus flowers and the gentle blue water of the eternal Nile. Paradise, for Sennacherib, looked like home, like the best version of home, like the place you always hoped your life would feel like, on the best possible day. Is there a more human vision of eternity than that? Not transcendence, not dissolution into something vast and formless, not escape from the world, but the world itself, made perfect, made permanent, made safe. The valley is quiet now. The pharaohs sleep in museums and climate-controlled storage rooms. The craftsman's village is an open-air ruin, its walls standing to waist height, its streets empty under the desert sun. But the tombs remain, the paintings remain, the words remain. And sometimes, standing in the cool dimness of one of those rock-cut corridors, surrounded by images painted by human hands on a morning 3,000 years ago, you can feel, very faintly, like something still present in the stone and the air and the extraordinary, patient silence of the valley, the weight of all that love, all that care, all that stubborn, ancient, beautiful insistence that some things should last. We have spoken, in earlier chapters, of the pharaoh as an institution, as a divine concept, as the living embodiment of cosmic order, the vessel through which Ma'at flowed into the world. But tonight, in this gentle hour, let us draw a little closer. Let us set aside the theology for a moment and look at the human beings themselves, the particular, individual, irreplaceable people who sat upon that ancient throne and shaped the course of one of the longest-lasting civilizations in human history. Because the pharaohs were not interchangeable. They were not simply interchangeable holders of a divine office, each one identical to the last. They were people with personalities and passions and fears and ambitions and blind spots and moments of extraordinary courage and moments of very ordinary weakness. And the history of Egypt, read slowly and carefully, is in many ways the history of those personalities colliding with the world. Let us begin with Djoser. We have met him briefly already as the pharaoh for whom Imhotep built the first pyramid. But Djoser himself deserves a moment of attention. He ruled during the Third Dynasty, around 2650 BCE, at a time when Egypt was still a relatively young unified kingdom. The step pyramid he commissioned at Saqqara was not just an architectural innovation. It was a statement, a declaration that Egypt was capable of something that had never existed before in the history of the world. To commission a building of that scale and ambition required not just wealth, but vision, the willingness to imagine something that didn't yet exist, to look at the flat-roofed mastaba tombs of previous rulers and think more, higher, something that reaches toward the sky. Djoser may not have been the one who conceived the pyramid form. That credit goes to Imhotep. But he was the one who said yes, the one who put the resources of an entire kingdom behind an unprecedented idea. There is something in that quality, the willingness to say yes to an unprecedented idea, that feels worth pausing on, here in the quiet dark of this drifting hour. Now let us move forward in time, to a pharaoh who ruled during what is known as the Old Kingdom's Golden Age. Khufu, or Cheops, as the Greeks called him, is the man who commissioned the Great Pyramid of Giza, the largest pyramid ever built, the structure that stood as the tallest thing in the world for nearly 4,000 years. Khufu is, in many ways, a mysterious figure. We know relatively little about him as a person. The historical record from his reign is sparse compared to later periods, and perhaps most remarkably, the only confirmed portrait of Khufu that survives is the smallest. A tiny ivory figurine, less than 3 inches tall, depicting a seated man wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt. That is all. The man who ordered the construction of one of the most massive structures in human history is represented in surviving art by an object you could hold between 2 fingers. History is full of these quiet ironies. What we do know is that Khufu ruled for approximately 23 years, that he was a strong and effective administrator, and that the Great Pyramid was completed during his reign through an organizational achievement of staggering complexity. Coordinating tens of thousands of workers, enormous quantities of stone from quarries hundreds of miles away, a logistics chain involving boats and sledges and ramps, and the careful sequencing of tasks that had never been attempted before at such scale. This required not just resources, but extraordinary administrative intelligence. The Pyramid of Khufu is not just a monument to divine kingship. It is a monument to human organizational capacity, to the ability of human beings working together under shared purpose and careful direction to achieve things that seem impossible when viewed from the perspective of any single individual. Several centuries forward to one of the most intriguing and controversial figures in all of Egyptian history, a pharaoh who did something no other pharaoh before or after him ever attempted, with quite the same radical completeness. Akhenaten. Akhenaten came to the throne as Amenhotep IV around 1353 BCE, during the 18th dynasty, the same dynasty that included Tutankhamun and Hatshepsut. He inherited a prosperous and powerful Egypt, with a rich and complex religious tradition centered on the vast temple complexes of gods like Amun, Ra, Osiris, and the many others we have met in these chapters. And then, gradually, he began to dismantle it. Akhenaten declared that there was essentially one god worthy of worship, not Amun, not Ra, not Osiris or Horus or any of the established deities of the Egyptian pantheon, but the Aten, the solar disk itself, not the sun god, not a deity with the sun as his symbol, but the physical disk of the sun, understood as the sole creative force of the universe, the source of all life and warmth and light, deserving of exclusive devotion. He changed his own name from Amenhotep, which honored Amun, to Akhenaten, meaning something like effective for the Aten or servant of the Aten. He closed the temples of the other gods. He redirected their vast economic resources. He ordered the name of Amun chiseled from inscriptions wherever it appeared. He moved the capital of Egypt from Thebes to a brand new city built from scratch in the desert, a place he called Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, which we now call Amarna. This was not a gradual theological evolution. It was a revolution, a sudden, sweeping, comprehensive overturning of a religious system that had been building for nearly 1500 years. Why? That question has occupied scholars for generations. Was Akhenaten a genuine religious visionary, a mystic who had an authentic experience of the divine that transcended the polytheistic tradition he had been born into? Was he a political strategist, using monotheism as a tool to break the enormous political and economic power of the priestly class, particularly the priests of Amun, who had grown extraordinarily wealthy and influential? Was he mentally ill in some way that caused him to act in extreme and destabilizing ways? Was he, as some more speculative scholars have suggested, influenced by outside ideas from elsewhere in the ancient Near East? We don't know. We may never know. What we do know is that his reign produced some of the most extraordinary art in Egyptian history. The art of the Amarna period is unlike anything else in 3,000 years of Egyptian artistic tradition. Where Egyptian art was normally formal, idealized, unchanging, the human figure depicted in its ideal, rather than its actual form, faces serene and ageless, bodies proportioned according to sacred canons rather than anatomical reality. Amarna art was different, startlingly different. Amarna art was intimate, personal. It showed Akhenaten and his wife, the famous Nefertiti, with their daughters, playing together, kissing them, bouncing them on their knees. It showed the Aten's rays ending in small human hands, reaching down to offer the Ankh, the symbol of life, to the royal family. The figures of Akhenaten himself were strange and distinctive. Elongated skull, narrow face, thick lips, pendulous belly, wide hips. Whether this represented a real physical condition, a theological statement about the pharaoh's divine androgyny, or an artistic convention specific to this period, is still debated, but the result is arresting. The royal family of the Amarna period looks like a real family. Imperfect, physical, present in their bodies in a way that almost no other royal depictions in Egyptian history achieve. There is a famous limestone relief showing Akhenaten and Nefertiti seated together, leaning toward each other, holding their daughters, the sun disk above them, sending its many-handed rays to touch them all. It looks less like a formal royal portrait and more like a moment caught. Nefertiti herself is one of the most famous faces in the ancient world, thanks to a painted limestone bust discovered in the workshop of a sculptor named Thutmose in 1912. The bust, now in the Neues Museum in Berlin, shows a woman of extraordinary beauty and composed authority. Her eyes are calm and direct. Her neck is long and elegant. The colors of her skin and her elaborate headdress are still vivid after 3,000 years. But here is the mystery. After approximately 12 years of Akhenaten's reign, Nefertiti disappears from the historical record completely. She was perhaps the most prominently depicted queen in Egyptian history, present in almost every official image of the period, and then, simply, she is gone. Did she die? Did she fall from favor? Did she, as some scholars have recently suggested, actually become pharaoh herself under a different name after Akhenaten's death? We don't know. Egypt is full of these beautiful, tantalizing silences, questions that the record raises and then declines to answer. Akhenaten died around 1336 BCE. His successor, possibly Nefertiti, possibly a figure named Smenkhkare, possibly someone else entirely, ruled briefly, and then came Tutankhamun, the boy king, who, as we touched on in Chapter 2, reversed almost everything Akhenaten had done. The temples of the old gods were reopened. The name of Amun was restored. The city of Akhetaten was abandoned to the desert. And eventually, Akhenaten himself was erased from the official record. His name chiseled out. His city left to crumble. His extraordinary religious experiment declared over. The desert reclaimed Akhetaten slowly. Sand drifted through its empty streets. Painted walls faded. The sunlight, the Aten, that sole and exclusive divine force, shone on the ruins without favor or discrimination, the way it had always shone on everything. Now let us move forward again, further in time, to a pharaoh who appears on more monuments, in more inscriptions, and in more temple reliefs than any other ruler in Egyptian history. A man who ruled for 67 years and seems, in many ways, to have willed himself into immortality through the sheer force of his presence. Ramesses II, Ramesses the Great. He came to the throne in his early 20s, around 1279 BCE, and ruled until his death in his 90s. He outlived 12 of his own heirs. He fought a famous battle against the Hittites at a place called Kadesh, a battle that may have been something of a draw in military terms, but which Ramesses celebrated for the rest of his life as a magnificent personal triumph. He had the story carved on temple after temple, in text and image, a great narrative of his own bravery, the chariot charging into battle, the enemies falling, the divine power of the pharaoh manifesting on the field. He built, more than any other pharaoh, the temples at Abu Simbel, carved directly into a cliff face in the far south of Egypt, are perhaps the most dramatic of his constructions. Two enormous facades cut into the living rock, guarded by four colossal seated statues of Ramesses himself, each one approximately 20 meters tall. The interior of the larger temple extends 90 meters into the cliff, its walls covered in scenes of battle and divine encounter. And at the very back, in the innermost sanctuary, four figures sit in eternal darkness. Ramesses himself alongside three gods. But here is the extraordinary detail. The temple was aligned with such precision that on two specific days each year, the 21st of February and the 21st of October, the rising sun penetrates the full length of the temple and illuminates the four figures in the innermost sanctuary, light traveling 90 meters through solid rock, touching the faces of gods and a god-king on the anniversary of his coronation and his birthday, 2 days out of 365. Planned for, engineered, achieved. Ramesses had a wife named Nefertari, different from Nefertiti despite the similar name, and his devotion to her was extraordinary and well documented. He built her a temple at Abu Simbel alongside his own, smaller but by no means insignificant. Its entrance is guarded by alternating statues of Ramesses and Nefertari, depicted at the same scale. This was unprecedented. Queens were normally depicted smaller than pharaohs in official art, but in Nefertari's temple, she stands as tall as her husband, an artistic choice that speaks volumes about what she meant to him. He wrote poetry for her, or at least, poetry was written in his name to her. One passage, inscribed on the walls of her temple, says that she was someone for whom the sun shone, someone whose existence was itself a form of light. She predeceased him by many years. He outlived her, as he outlived almost everyone he knew. He continued to rule into his 80s and 90s, his body showing in his mummy the signs of extraordinary age, severe arthritis, dental abscesses, atherosclerosis. He had probably been in considerable pain for the last years of his life. And yet he continued, still the pharaoh, still the living God, still the most powerful person in the ancient world, even as his body slowly, quietly failed. There is something moving in that image. the old man in the palace, his joints aching, his teeth gone, his wives and children long dead, still sitting in the divine seat, still maintaining the performance of divinity that the world required of him, still holding the crook and flail, still the axis around which Egypt turned. He died at approximately 90 years of age. His mummy, now in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, is one of the most studied in the world. His face is still recognizable, strong-jawed, long-nosed. A face that has stared out from its painted coffin through more than 3,000 years with an expression of composed, unassailable authority, as if he always knew he would outlast everything, and in a way, he did. His temples still stand. His statues still gaze across the desert. His name is still spoken, still recognized, still carrying the weight and resonance of a life that pressed itself so deeply into the record of the world that 3,000 years of time could not erase it. Let these lives rest with you now, these extraordinary, particular, human lives, as your own breath slows and your body softens into the surface beneath you. Djoser, who said yes to an impossible idea. Khufu, whose monument outlasted his portrait. Akhenaten, who staked everything on a vision. Nefertiti, whose face we know and whose story we don't. Tutankhamun, who was forgotten and found. Hatshepsut, who wore the beard and ruled with quiet certainty. Ramesses, who wrote poems for his wife and built temples to last forever. They were people, real people, people who woke up in the morning and went to sleep at night and felt the sun on their faces and the weight of an enormous responsibility on their shoulders, and the particular complicated mixture of love and loneliness and purpose and fear that is the human condition in any century, in any civilization, beneath any sky. They lived, fully and completely, and then they trusted the stone to remember them. The stone did. We have come a long way tonight, you and I, drifting together through the long, golden corridors of one of the oldest civilizations humanity has ever known. We have walked in the shadow of pyramids and descended into tombs. We have met gods with animal heads and pharaohs with divine titles. We have watched scribes work by lamplight and farmers rise before dawn. We have heard the sound of music at a festival and felt the quiet weight of a letter written to a wife who had already gone. And now, in this last chapter, let us drift even more slowly. Let us allow the great river itself to carry us. Let us follow the Nile from its ancient banks to the present moment and feel the extraordinary, almost impossible continuity of everything this civilization left behind. Because Egypt did not simply end. Civilizations are not like candles that gutter and go dark in a single moment. They fade, they transform, they are absorbed into what comes after. And what ancient Egypt left behind, in the fabric of human knowledge, human art, human spirituality, human architecture, human medicine, human language, is so vast and so deep and so thoroughly woven into the world we inhabit now that we often don't notice it. The way you don't notice the foundation of a house, the way you don't notice the deep roots of a tree that has been standing in the same place for centuries. Let us begin with the Nile itself, because the Nile has not changed, not in any essential way. It still flows from the mountains of Central Africa northward to the Mediterranean. It still carries sediment. It still gives life to a narrow strip of land on either side of its banks. It still moves with that same patient, ancient, inexorable quality. The same quality that the Egyptians observed and celebrated and built their entire civilization around. The Aswan High Dam, completed in 1970, changed the flooding patterns of the Nile permanently. The annual inundation that had structured Egyptian life for thousands of years was ended, controlled, managed, its waters stored in the vast artificial lake behind the dam. The black soil no longer arrives in annual gifts from the river. Farmers now use chemical fertilizers where the Nile silt once did its quiet, generous work. But the river flows, and the people along its banks still live close to its rhythms, still plant and harvest and fish and build along its edges, still look at the water on summer evenings and feel something that has no name, something that might be the deep cellular memory of 10,000 years of human life along these banks, pressing up through the generations like water through stone. The ancient Egyptians would recognize the Nile. They would recognize its color in late afternoon, that particular shade of green-blue shot through with gold. They would recognize the way the palm trees stand along its banks, still and graceful in the heat. They would recognize the calls of the ibises, still present, still wading in the shallows, still carrying the memory of Thoth in their long curved beaks. Now, let us think about what Egypt gave to the world, because the legacy of this civilization is not confined to Egypt. It traveled, it spread, it seeped into the foundations of other cultures, other traditions, other ways of understanding the world. Mathematics. The ancient Egyptians were sophisticated mathematicians for their time. They worked with fractions. They calculated areas and volumes. They understood basic principles of geometry. They had to build the way they built. The precision of the pyramids, the alignment of the temples, the careful surveying of agricultural land after each flood. All of this required mathematical knowledge that was carefully developed and transmitted through generations of scribal education. The Egyptians used a decimal system, base 10, just as we do. They had symbols for 1, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, and 1 million. Their calculation of the value of pi, the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter, was accurate to within less than 1%. A remarkable achievement for a civilization working with rope and counting boards, and the patient accumulation of observation over centuries. Medicine. Egyptian medical knowledge was extraordinary for its era and formed one of the foundations on which later Greek and then Western medicine was built. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, named for the American dealer who purchased it in the 19th century, is a medical text dating to around 1600 BCE, though it may be a copy of an even older original. It describes 48 cases of injury and illness, each one examined systematically, the symptoms described, an examination procedure outlined, a diagnosis offered, and a treatment recommended. The approach is empirical, rational. Cases are classified into 3 categories: ailments that can be treated, ailments that can be managed but not cured, and ailments that should not be treated because they are beyond help. That last category in particular suggests a medical culture sophisticated enough to recognize its own limits, to say, this is beyond what we can do. A quality of honest self-assessment that is, in any era, a sign of genuine intellectual maturity. The Egyptians understood the heart as the center of the circulatory system. They performed surgical procedures, They used plants with genuine medicinal properties, willow bark, which contains the active ingredient of aspirin, honey, a natural antimicrobial, applied to wounds, moldy bread, pressed against infected cuts, in a practice that anticipates the discovery of penicillin by 3,000 years. They were not scientists in the modern sense. They did not separate the empirical from the magical, but they were careful observers. They paid attention. They wrote things down, and what they wrote influenced the physicians of ancient Greece, who influenced the physicians of Rome, who influenced the medieval Islamic scholars, who preserved and extended that knowledge, who influenced the European physicians of the Renaissance and Enlightenment, who built the foundations of modern medicine. The thread runs, unbroken, from an Egyptian physician pressing honey into a wound 3,000 years ago, to the antiseptic protocols of a modern operating theatre. The thread is thin and hard to see at points, but it is there. Calendar. The ancient Egyptians developed one of the earliest solar calendars in human history. They observed that the annual flooding of the Nile coincided with the heliacal rising of Sirius, the moment when that brilliant star first becomes visible on the eastern horizon just before sunrise after a period of invisibility. And they used this celestial event to anchor their calendar, dividing the year into 12 months of 30 days each, with 5 intercalary days added at the end to make up the full 365. This calendar was later adopted and refined by the Romans, particularly during the reign of Julius Caesar, who reformed the Roman calendar in 46 BCE with the help of an Egyptian astronomer. The Julian calendar, with its 365 days and its concept of the leap year, was a direct descendant of the ancient Egyptian calendar, and the Gregorian calendar we use today is a refinement of the Julian calendar. Every time you glance at a date on your phone or the corner of a computer screen, every time you note an appointment, remember a birthday, mark the beginning of a new year, you are using a system whose roots stretch back to ancient Egyptian astronomers watching the pre-dawn sky for the first glimmer of Sirius above the horizon. Architecture. The influence of Egyptian architecture on the Western world is visible and immediate and everywhere, once you begin to look for it. The obelisk, that slender, tapered, four-sided column with a pyramidal top, was an Egyptian invention, originally carved from single pieces of granite and erected in pairs before temple entrances as symbols of the sun's rays. Obelisks now stand in capitals across the world. In Rome, where multiple Egyptian obelisks were transported in antiquity, there are more ancient Egyptian obelisks than in Egypt itself. In Paris, at the center of the Place de la Concorde. In London, on the embankment beside the Thames. In New York, in Central Park. The pyramid form itself has never entirely left human architecture. It appears again and again, across centuries and cultures. The Mayan pyramids of Central America, though developed independently, arrived at the same fundamental form. The glass pyramid of the Louvre, designed by the architect I.M. Pei and completed in 1989, stands in the courtyard of one of the world's greatest museums as a conscious echo of an ancient form. The Washington Monument, with its obelisk silhouette, is unmistakably Egyptian in its ancestry. The column, that fundamental element of classical architecture, has Egyptian roots too. The papyrus bundle columns of Egyptian temple hypostyle halls were among the earliest large-scale architectural columns in human history, and they influenced the Greek column forms that in turn influenced Roman architecture, which in turn influenced the architecture of the Renaissance and every subsequent era that looked to the classical world for inspiration. Spirituality. The influence of Egyptian religious ideas on the traditions that came after is a complex and endlessly debated topic among scholars. But some connections are clear. The concept of the soul's judgment after death, the weighing of moral character against a divine standard, appears in various forms in the Abrahamic traditions that emerged in the Near East, in close geographical and cultural contact with Egypt. The idea of resurrection, of death overcome, of life restored after apparent ending, was central to Egyptian belief thousands of years before it became central to the world's most widely practiced religion. The goddess Isis, with her infant son Horus on her lap, is a visual motif so powerful and so enduring that art historians have traced its influence forward through centuries of image making, finding its echo in the Madonna and Child iconography of Christian art. Not a direct borrowing necessarily, but the same deep human need for the image of a mother and a divine child, for the warmth and protection of that particular relationship between the human and the sacred, expressing itself in different cultural vocabularies, but recognizably, movingly, the same. The Ankh, the Egyptian symbol of life, that cross with a loop at the top, was adopted by early Coptic Christians in Egypt as one of their symbols. The Coptic cross, still used today by the Coptic Christian community in Egypt, which traces its origins to the Apostle Mark and has been present in Egypt since the 1st century CE, carries within it the visual memory of a symbol that was already ancient when Christianity was born. Egypt never entirely ended. It transformed. It contributed. It gave and gave and gave to everything that came after, and then stepped back into the desert and the silence and the slow, patient work of becoming archaeology, becoming history, becoming the kind of thing that people study in universities and visit in museums and lie awake thinking about in the quiet hours before sleep. Becoming perhaps the kind of thing that finds you in the night, when the ordinary world has gone quiet and the mind begins to loosen its grip on the present moment, and offers you a glimpse of something very old and very deep and very patient, something that has been waiting, with all the unhurried certainty of the desert, for someone to be still enough and quiet enough to feel it. The Nile still flows. The stars that guided pyramid builders still wheel overhead on clear nights. The same constellations in the same positions they occupied when the first careful eyes mapped them from the rooftops of a mud brick village in the Nile Valley 5,000 years ago. Orion still rises. Sirius still blazes. The circumpolar stars still turn in their slow circle around the northern point of the sky, the imperishable ones, never setting, never going dark. The pyramids still stand in the desert at Giza. They are a little shorter than they once were. The smooth white limestone casing that once covered them, reflecting the sun like mirrors, has long since been stripped away and used in the construction of medieval Cairo. But the core remains. Those millions of blocks of stone, fitted together with extraordinary precision, still standing after 4,500 years. Still pointing, with that tiny fraction of a degree of deviation, toward true north. still aligned with the stars, still aimed at eternity. The hieroglyphs on the temple walls are still readable now, thanks to Champollion and all the scholars who have built on his work. The gods still have their names: Osiris and Isis, Ra and Thoth, Anubis and Hathor, Horus and Set, all still nameable, still storyable, still carrying within their ancient mythologies the deep truths about human experience that they were created to carry. The mummies still rest in museums and in unexcavated tombs that even now are being carefully found by archaeologists working in the desert, still making discoveries, still adding to the picture, still slowly assembling the vast jigsaw of a civilization that lasted 3,000 years. And somewhere along the Nile, on a warm evening, when the light is golden and the water is moving slowly and the palm trees are very still, there is always a moment, a particular quality of the late afternoon light, a quality that travelers describe across centuries of writing about Egypt, a quality that seems to say something just beyond the edge of language, that seems to contain something about time and beauty and the brevity and the strange, enduring persistence of human life, a quality that makes you feel, very quietly, that you are not entirely separate from all of this, that something in you recognizes it, that the part of you which is oldest and deepest and most essentially human knows this light, has always known it, has been sitting by this river in imagination or in some more mysterious way for as long as human beings have been sitting by rivers and looking at the water and feeling the particular wordless emotion of being alive in a world so much older and larger and more beautiful than any individual life. The ancient Egyptians had a word, Djet. It meant eternity in the sense of endless repetition, the eternal cycle, the Nile flooding and receding, the sun rising and setting, birth and death and rebirth, cycling through the world like the slow turning of the circumpolar stars. And they had another word, Nehe, eternity in the sense of endless forward motion, the future stretching onward without limit, the horizon that is always there, always receding, always inviting the next step forward. Both kinds of eternity, the circular and the linear, the returning and the progressing, both present, both real, both honored by a civilization that understood that the world was more complex and more beautiful and more layered with meaning than any single framework could contain. We are, all of us, made of both. We return to what we know, the daily rhythms, the familiar faces, the recurring seasons of our small lives, and we move forward into the future, into the unknown, into the next moment, and the next, and the next. The Egyptians understood that both of these things were sacred. Both were part of Ma'at. Both were part of the great, slow, patient order of the universe, working itself out through millions of individual lives across thousands of years. And now, as this last chapter closes, as our long, drifting journey through the world of ancient Egypt comes gently to its end, let us rest in that understanding for a moment. You have traveled a long way tonight, from the black soil of Kemet to the golden chambers of the Valley of the Kings, from the divine certainty of a pharaoh to the careful hands of a scribe, from the weighing of a heart against a feather to the warmth of a family eating together in the evening light. You have held in your mind things that are very old and very large and very beautiful. And now, let them settle. Let them drift down through your consciousness like sediment through slow water, coming to rest in the deep, quiet places where things are kept without effort. Let your breath be very slow now, in and out, like the tide, like the river, like the rhythm of a world that has been breathing since long before you were born and will go on breathing long after every concern you carry tonight has dissolved into the past. Your shoulders can be very heavy now. Your jaw can be soft. The muscles around your eyes, let them release entirely. There is nothing you need to see right now. There is nothing you need to watch for. The world is safe and still and dark and quiet, and you are held within it, the way the mummy was held within its wrappings, gently, carefully, completely. The Nile is flowing somewhere in the dark. The stars are turning overhead. The pyramids stand in the desert, pointed at things you cannot see from here, but which are there, patient and permanent, waiting with all the unhurried certainty of stone. And you are here, warm and breathing and alive. In this particular moment, on this particular night, with all of human history stretching behind you like a river finding its way to the sea, and all of the future opening ahead, quiet and vast, and full of things not yet imagined. Rest now. Let Egypt settle into your dreams like golden dust in still water. Let the gods walk quietly through the corridors of sleep. Let the river carry you, gently, softly, further and further from the waking world, into the deep, dark, beautiful silence of the night, where everything old is still present, and everything is held, and you are safe and still and drifting, like light on the water, like the slow wheel of stars, like the breath of a world that has always known your name and has been waiting very patiently to welcome you home.